Good morning, and thank you so much again for joining us for SCSA's Toolbox Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about working safely around powered mobile equipment. I will just share my screen with you. Just a few minor housekeeping things before we get right into it. Like always, these are recorded and will be available on all of our social media channels. And if you have any questions, you can get a hold of us on any one of those channels, Facebook, YouTube, or directly on our website. Okay, so working safely around powered mobile equipment. As winter approaches, we're likely going to see a few more of these running around. So it's important to work safely around them and just to understand the hazards. So the first thing we want to talk about is what exactly is powered mobile equipment? What qualifies under the legislation as PME? So we have a few legislative definitions that are going to pop up here. The first one basically says powered mobile equipment means any self-propelled machine that is designed to manipulate or to move materials and provide or provide a work platform for workers. So in that definition, we get your dozers, your excavators, your scissor lifts, anything that can move materials or hold people up. And the second definition that we need to be aware of is the one for vehicle. So a vehicle, again, means a machine that a person or thing may be transported. So cars and trucks count as powered mobile equipment and includes that PME. So those two definitions kind of combine the two. So whether it's an excavator, a truck, a boom truck, a car, it's powered mobile equipment under the legislation. So there's a few common hazards when it comes to working around powered mobile equipment. One of the more common ones is struck by hazards. So heavy equipment's responsible for a lot of injuries and even fatalities in the workplace. Ground personnel are far too often hit or struck by equipment when they're in the line of fire. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Property damage incidences. When operators can see vehicles, materials, objects, tools, buildings, if they're in their blind spots, property damage can occur. This can cost a lot of money per year for a company if they're not careful. Collisions. So these are generally caused by blind spots, complacency, congested work areas. This is very common on congested work sites where there's multiple equipment running or even vehicles pulling onto site. So being aware of designated travel areas is one of the more important things to avoid collisions, as well as miscommunication. So just not being clear with spotters, with signalers, and with the operators themselves. So taking time to walk the job, walk the route that the equipment's going to travel, and making sure that everyone's on the same page before that equipment starts up for the day. So just some PME basics. As far as legislation is required, the things that you need to do when you're working on or around PME. So one of the first things is personal protective equipment. So under the legislation, if you're working around any type of PME or vehicle or traffic near roadways, one of the things you see on everyone is high visibility clothing. So if you're working around that kind of stuff, you need to be highly visible. So you need to wear that. As well, on a construction site, which is where we're going to see a lot of this stuff happening, it is required that you have safety footwear as well as head protection on construction sites. So those are three of the more common ones you're going to see when people are working around PME, as well as training. So in order to operate a piece of equipment, you must be what's called a competent operator. That person has a minimum of 16 hours of training, both classroom and practical. If you're in the process of obtaining that training and getting through those 16 hours, you can operate the equipment as long as you're under the supervision of that competent operator. And as well, another big thing to keep aware of is exhaust and ventilation. So if you're using gas-powered machines, they obviously put out exhaust. Depending on where you're working, you need to be aware of where those exhaust fumes are going, if ventilation might be necessary. Even in open work sites, if you're working in a corner where there's a possibility of exhaust gases collecting, that's something to be aware of and either switch to an electric type of machine or allow for ventilation and set that up. The other big thing when it comes to PME is blind spots. We have a whole presentation specifically just geared towards the blind spots. So they vary from one piece of equipment to another, so it's important to be aware of the specific equipment you're working around and its blind spots. If you can't see the operator, they can't see you. That's the general rule of thumb. Always try to walk on the driver's side of equipment if you do have to walk around them, as the passenger side generally has more blind spots. So you can see in this diagram on the screen here, this is an excavator. Now, they may not all exactly be the same, but for the most part, these blacked out grayed areas are the blind spots for that equipment. And so the operator can't see what's in that area, what's going on in that area, if somebody's passing through that area. So those are the areas you want to avoid. So again, ensuring you establish eye contact with the operator if you're walking around the equipment. Stay on the driver's side. Steer clear of those danger zones around the equipment, so these darkened areas. And each piece of equipment, again, has its own blind spot. So be aware of the equipment you're operating and what the blind spots are there. Just another example of that to show the difference in different pieces of equipment. This is a skid steer here, so a very common piece of equipment on construction sites. The gray areas around that are the blind spots that the operator can't see when operating. So you can see that the blind spot actually goes out further than 12 feet on the driver's left-hand flank. So there's quite a large area on this tiny piece of equipment, relatively small piece of equipment, that the operator just can't see what's going on in that area. So those are the areas you want to avoid. Another really common way of directing traffic is using designated signalers with equipment. So they reduce hazards and they kind of give the operator that second set of eyes when working in tight spaces especially. And there are a few requirements of designated signalers when they are going to be used on site. So the first one is they have to be trained. You can't just put the new guy out there and say, hey, direct the work of this operator that's pushing a 52,000-pound excavator around. They need to know what they're doing and they need to know the appropriate signals to be giving and how to look for the hazards that the operator could face. They must don the appropriate PPE. So of course, boots, hard hat, minimums, but also that high visibility equipment. Depending on when and where you're operating, you might need tools like flashlights or signage to help communicate with the operator or people around the equipment what to do and what not to do. As well, you must ensure it's safe to proceed before signaling to do so. So that's part of the training aspect of it, right? Being aware of not just what's going on directly in front of you, but what's going to go on as you travel the path of the equipment. And only one designated signaler giving directions at one time. So this is a legislated requirement. Generally, there is only one signaler, but in situations where there are two, the important aspect is those signalers have contact with each other. So whether that's radio or hand signals, it doesn't really matter. As long as they're in contact and only one person is giving direction at one time. And then the final thing there is using radio or hand signals. So again, this comes back to the training. Hand signals are very specific for operating, so people need to be aware of what they are and what they mean, so that you're not giving inadvertent or bad hand signals. So it all comes back to training. The other big thing when it comes to using any type of vehicle or PME is the pre-use inspections. So we can't overlook these at all. The legislation, as well as manufacturers of this equipment, require that visual inspections are completed prior to use. Your employers might often have you actually fill out a checklist style document just to say that, you know, you've checked things like air pressure and the hydraulic lines, that there's no obvious damage or cracks in the welds and things like that. So that visual inspection, we have from the legislation, section 155 of the regulation says, before a worker starts any piece of PME, an employer contractor shall ensure that they complete a visual inspection of the equipment and the surrounding area to ensure that no worker, including the operator, is endangered by the startup of that equipment. And the legislation goes further to say no worker shall start any PME until that inspection required by subsection 1, the one I just read through, is completed. So not only do you have to do it, but it goes a little bit further and says you can't start the equipment until you do it. Another thing to touch on with PME is equipment failure or overturning. So what's called a dangerous occurrence is explained in Section 9 of the OH&S regulations, and it specifies numerous incidents that are required to be reported to OH&S, and one of those things involves PME. So the definition says a failure of a crane, of a hoist, or the overturning of a crane or the unit of power mobile equipment. So if a vehicle or a piece of equipment were to tip over, that is considered a dangerous occurrence. And if that occurs, the legislation requires that the employer has to give notice to the division, which means OH&S, as soon as reasonably possible of any occurrence that takes place, whether or not a worker sustained injury. So just because it tipped over and nothing happened and nothing was really damaged, maybe other than the equipment, that doesn't matter. If it happens, it happens, and it's a reportable incident. And just some takeaways regarding powered mobile equipment to leave with today. So again, PPE requirements, if you're on or around powered mobile equipment, high visibility clothing, safety footwear, hard hats. If you're working in something like a scissor lift where it's lifting you up above that 10 feet, that minimum height, then fall protection is another type of PME or PPE rather that would be required. Be aware of the blind spots. So usually inside of your manufacturer's directions in the manual, it will actually have a diagram of the equipment and it'll show you the blind spots. So be aware of the equipment that you're operating, what's on site, and where those blind spots are. Again, if you have to walk around equipment, two things: stay on the driver's side and make eye contact. The passenger side generally has more blind spots and they may not be able to see you coming. You must, you must train and use spotters or designated signalers. If you are using them, they need to be trained. As well as complete your pre-use inspections as required. Again, that's both legislated and generally a manufacturer's requirement. And report dangerous occurrences if they do happen to happen. The intent of reporting them isn't to get yourself in trouble, it's for OH&S to assist the company in ensuring that the investigation is done properly and that there's corrective actions to ensure that that never happens again. And that's it for today's Toolbox Talk. Short and sweet around working safely around power mobile equipment. Again, if you want to watch this again or share it, it'll be available on all of our social media channels. And if you have any questions or concerns, you can get a hold of us on our website or on our Facebook. In the meantime, stay safe and stay healthy and have a great day.